guests, I'll be exploring the stories behind the Adi Yeta, a Fijian open ocean canoe, Collective Spirit, a sailboat made of over 1,500 donated objects, and the fate of endangered traditional working boats. Boats are a part of the maritime cultural landscape, and this series aims to highlight their significance to communities and tell some of the personal narratives embodied in the boats themselves. So before we start, I just want you to remember, if you do have any questions or any comments this evening, you can put them in the chat box below. And to kick things off this evening, I'd like to welcome Katrina Talei Igglesden, an academic and creative of mixed British and Fijian ancestry. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher on the British Academy-funded research program, Urban Pathways, Fiji Youth, Arts and Culture. Bula, Katrina.
Bula vinaka, Elma. Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure. So at this time in our history, when we see a return to sort of divisive politics, we also see through the current world situation that we are ultimately all in the same canoe, facing the same issues such as climate change, global capitalism, and the rise in poverty. With the onset of Brexit, Britain has become once again an island nation. So what for you are the similarities between island nations, and are there characteristics that islanders share? And perhaps, Shahira, you could show us the two maps. Is that too many questions?
No, I think those are great questions. Just waiting for the map.
Oh, okay, let's have a look at the maps, yes.
Because they are beautiful pieces of art, these two maps that we have here. You're right, Elma, the world that we're living in right now can be divisive in so many different ways. I think, however, if you look at these two maps that are sitting in front of us, we can really see that we're far more similar than we are different in all areas of the world. In the Pacific, we are a sea of islands. We are islands connected by a vast ocean, not islands divided by an ocean. And I think that's the same case here for the UK now in the situation we're in. We all face the same climate issues, just in very different forms. So, you know, the Pacific is a very tropical set of climate-driven issues, but here we're facing the same coastal erosion, sea level rising, weather pattern changes, everything like that is the same. And we're all, you know, land masses surrounded by bodies of water. And historically, the water was so important to the UK, and historically the water was and still is incredibly important to the Pacific. So being able to navigate the waters and the oceans is a real connector, I think, between the two areas of the world.
Because I think sometimes, as I said, like Britain, they forget that they have been an island, or that they are an island, because we've like, oh, it's Europe. But it's, like you said, very much the same, and to different degrees. The climate change is affecting us all. But and just another thing that is a similarity, because sometimes people look and see other islands' traditions and think, oh, you know, that's their tradition. But like, just for example, with boats and the naming of boats can be quite similar as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the naming of boats, the tradition that you have in Fiji, and how it's similar to everyone else's?
Sure. Well, I think the similarities are endless, first of all. You know, just like here, how, you know, a bottle of champagne is broken on the side of a ship to commemorate the occasion and to launch her, really. The same process, sans champagne, happens as well in Fiji, where there are particular protocols that go along with each step of building any kind of canoe, the draw in particular, which we'll talk about in a second, of which Adi Yeta is. But there are multiple kind of protocols that go along, from felling the trees in the forest, to moving the trees from one location to another, to starting the construction, to then naming the vessel as well. And as as here, I guess we should say, a vessel isn't complete without a name. So she cannot be launched and she cannot be used without naming her first. And just like here, all boats in Fiji are female as well. So another similar tradition, I think. And if we think about Adi Yeta, who's now in the Pacific Encounters Gallery, she went through 5 distinct protocols before she was kind of launched into the world. And she had, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but she's had a life before the museum, before she came into the Maritime Museum as well. So we'll get to talk more about that in a second.
Great stuff. Yeah, so let's introduce the Adi Yeta. If you could pull up the next slide first, please. And as you said, it's a drua. It's a traditional open ocean canoe. Can you explain the significance of Adi Yeta to Fijian culture as a seafaring nation? I mean, the importance of boats in general as well, but specifically the Adi Yeta.
Sure. So Adi Yeta is Andea, and Andea in Fijian means twin. So the twin comes from this double hull that you see on the screen there. And so she's got 2 hulls which are almost equal size in length. And Adi Yeta is an 8-meter or 26-foot drua. And she's had an incredible life before coming into the museum. She was first conceptualized in 2012 as part of the Fijian Art Research Project, which took place here in Norwich with the University of East Anglia and also the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge. And so the idea was to commission a real size, life size drua, or some kind of canoe. We didn't know what yet, but to commission one in order for people to understand, the importance and the significance of canoes and boat building within Fiji, but also to have something which the very large Fijian population here in the UK could also be proud of and come to know and come to love. So we've got thousands and thousands of Fijians here in the UK, thanks to the British Armed Forces and the Commonwealth recruitment process. So there are pockets of Fijians around the country. And Adi Yeta in the Pacific Encounters Gallery for the last, how many years has she been in there? 3 years. Okay. It's been open that long already. She's been a source of home really for the communities that come and see her. So she was actually built in 2014. So it took 2 years for that relationship to be established with the builders and the project. And she was built across 2014 and 15. And she's made completely from traditional materials. So there's no metal in her whatsoever. She's completely she's made of wood. She's made of mangi mangi, which is coconut coir, coconut husk cordage, and shells, which those are the white bits you can see on the screen there. So she's got cowrie shells on the ends of her hulls, and the sail, which unfortunately can't stand up in the gallery, but that's matted. So that's plaited pandanus leaf, and that's made by women. So they're mainly the wives of the builders that made her. But she's absolutely extraordinary in that she was built in 2014-15, and coincidentally, Fiji was struck by the worst cyclone to ever make landfall in the Pacific region in 2016, and Adi Yeta was shipped from Fiji 2 days before the cyclone hit. Had she not been, we don't quite know what would have happened, but she made it here in, I think it was about April of 2016, and then in May she went on to be part of the Her Majesty the Queen's 90th birthday pageant in Windsor. So she was part of the week-long fair there. And then following that, she was part of our exhibition here in Norwich called Fiji Art and Life in the Pacific. And then after that, she went to COP23 in Bonn in Germany, which Fiji presided over and chaired that climate change summit. And then finally, after a very long kind of trip around everywhere, she ended up in the Pacific Encounters Gallery. So the canoes in general are really significant in Fijian culture because of the ocean faring kind of history and present of Fijian culture, but also because it's a very specialized skill, canoe building. So canoes can only be built by certain lineages and certain families within Fiji. So it's a very specialized knowledge and skill that remains to this day. Only certain areas of Eastern Fiji are people not allowed to make it, but permitted, I guess is a better word, to have the knowledge to be able to do so.
Okay, and the knowledge, is it passed down through ancestry, or it is?
Yes.
So it would be father to son or daughter, father, it's in the family.
Yes, it's all male.
It's all male.
It's all male skill, unfortunately. Women are not part of that. And I think, as with potentially other kind of traditions here in the UK, it's a very gendered society in general, both Pacific and Fijian culture. So there are certain female skills and certain male skills, and there are certain certain taboos around kind of female involvement or male involvement in activities. So it is a very separate thing.
Although you did say that the sails are made by the women.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the body is all male built.
And I mean, how important is fishing? Because I'm assuming that it's mostly for fishing that it's used, that these boats are used. So how important is fishing in Fiji still today?
It's very important. Fishing is mostly a female thing, and was mostly a female thing, and it was mainly net fishing that was done. So the ndrua especially, they weren't used for fishing purposes. They were long voyage sailing canoes. So it would be transporting, for example, people from Fiji to Tonga or Fiji to Samoa, very, very long distances, and often used in battle voyages as well. So warriors going off to fight, for lack of a better term, in other areas.
Yeah.
And also a very chiefly thing as well. So chiefs from very powerful kingdoms would commission, much like you would today, I assume, commission ndrua to be built for their use as well.
And are they used today?
No. So there are, I think there's about 13 different types of canoes in Fiji, and I could be very wrong with that, but it's a lot anyways, but 13 sticks in my mind for some reason.
Right.
And different types remain used today and remain being built quite regularly. Ndrua did take quite a dive in being built kind of about 100 years ago. And that's for several different reasons. But urban drift, I think, also had a lot to do with it, because where they were traditionally built are in the Lau group, which is in eastern Fiji, which is quite far away from the mainland, where a lot of people ended up settling for work and things like that. But there's been a slow reinvigoration, I think you could say, of the knowledge being properly passed down and ndrua being built. So Adi Yeta was the first in, I don't want to say how many years, quite a few decades at least, to attempt to be built. And Chochi and Domo, who are the main builders of Adi Yeta, they've now built 2 more ndrua since Adi Yeta was built, and then another ndrua called Ivola Singavo has been built by another team of traditional builders. And so it does seem to be picking up, which is really,
that's great.
Nice. Yeah.
So Adi Yeta, when she was, you mentioned she was in London at the Queen's birthday, or and also in Germany for COP23. What sort of reaction or do people have when they first come across her, and the interest in her? What can you tell us about that? What kind of reactions does she get from other people?
I think fascination and awe is probably one of the main ones, because I think it's, especially in the situations that she's been in, and I think ironically very far away from water and her kind of normal environment than she would traditionally be in or should be in. And because of her size, and because of, I think, the sustainability and environmentally friendliness, I think, of Ndurwa and of you know, a lot of Pacific cultural taonga or yao are. It's just, it's a really stark reminder, I think, of what can be done and what we can all utilize in order to make for a better future and a friendlier future. And I think, you know, walking into Bonn, walking into the conference center there and seeing a 26-foot canoe was quite something for a lot of people. And the Germans, in fact, the German government were very kind in hosting COP23, because Fiji didn't have the physical infrastructure to be able to host 30,000 people in Fiji.
Yep.
And so as a thank you for being able to do so, what we see on the screen right now, her name is Andea, and she's about a 2-meter Ndurwa, which is a replica of Adi Yeta, and she was constructed and built as a gift to the city of Bonn and to the mayor of Bonn, to thank them for hosting and to leave something sustainable in place for Bonn's future.
So she was built as well in Fiji and then shipped over?
Yes, so she was built in pieces, really, in Fiji, and then finished in, so that little picture that you see is one corner of the Fiji pavilion at COP23. And so she was finished being built in the pavilion, so people could watch the process of her being fully constructed and put together.
Okay, and I think we have another picture from COP23, if we move on to the next slide, where you can see, yeah, this is lovely, and you can see some of the smiles, the pride in the boat as well. A very beautiful boat, it's lovely. So this was a much smaller version, and again, it's still in Bonn, I'm imagining.
It is. It was presented to the mayor on the last day of COP23, and we honestly didn't know what would happen to it, if you know, they would say thank you and then kind of stick it away somewhere, or what would happen. But we did receive photos much later, and she is sitting in the foyer of the city of Bonn's kind of main city hall, I guess you would call it. And so yes, she's been cared for with great pride, I think, as well, in being gifted to the city, and the builders did a beautiful job with her. And Andi Dangini Vesau, Dangini Vesau means winds of change, or change of wind.
Okay.
So it very much it signified at COP23 at that time this kind of hopeful change of the way the world works together and tackles climate change, which I don't think we've done a great job since COP23 in 2017, but hopefully we're going in a different direction now.
Well, yeah, I mean, so it's quite apt in a way that we were talking about this, and that she was there for COP23, and now we just had COP26. And I'm sure that you were watching that with a lot of interest, thinking of climate change and what effects that you're seeing in Fiji right now. What sort of things have you noticed like that are affecting a lot of the Pacific Islands and especially Fiji? What kind of effects are we seeing?
Oh, I think the lists are endless, and I think anything that you could mention is probably a yes. Sea level rising is very prominent. Erosion, soil erosion. Since I think 2014, there's been a growing list of villages and settlements that need to be moved from the coast further inland, because the erosion just literally keeps kind of creeping in
So a disappearance of communities then, or displacement of communities.
Absolutely, and with the whole concept of, you know, being tied to the land, and it's a very Pacific concept of, you know, having your place, and you know, land is such a larger concept than I think it is for a Western audience. It's very much rooted in your identity and your sense of belonging, and so I think being moved in that way can be quite traumatizing, for lack of a better word, to communities and to relationships and relations with everybody else around you. But it's also affecting, acid rain is also causing the acidification of soils, and it's causing crops not to grow properly, trees not to grow properly. So, you know, deforestation is also an issue. So finding trees and, you know, logs big enough to make proper sized canoes now is incredibly difficult.
Wow.
Adi Yeta, they had to trek into kind of the highlands of the main island of Viti Levu to find a tree large enough to be able to create her, because the way they are made is, in this case, is that it is one, you know, solid piece of wood as opposed to many pieces being put together.
Sure.
So it really, I mean, it affects everything, and the ocean warming, and, you know, marine species dying because, you know, the ocean is too warm. It's endless. Absolutely.
So yeah,
endless.
I mean, you're seeing it right in your face compared to a lot of, excuse me, a lot of places where we're just sort of looking on. It's not so affecting yet. But just thinking of COP26, have you seen or heard anything that's given you hope for the future, or has it been, like in the words of Greta Thunberg, all blah, blah, blah?
Well, to be very honest, I think there's a lot of blah, blah, blah going on
Yeah.
at the high level. However, I'm so encouraged and really pleased to see the youth really stepping up. There is a huge contingent of Pacific youth, especially at COP26, making a difference, taking a stand. And that's just been fantastic, because, you know, all of these talks that we're having really do focus on the future, and often, you know, 10, 20, 30 years in advance. And, you know, none of us are going to be here doing this work 10, 20, 30 years into the future. So it's going to be these youth that we have today, being the leaders of the future, enacting all of this work that's being done. So they are so important in the fight for climate justice, I think.
Right. Yeah. And we talked a little bit about the construction of Andea, the materials that you used, you mentioned, and the craftsmanship, the builder. Who was there? Two builders or one builder that actually made her?
So there was a team manager, so to speak. So Chochi Maral Misaele was the project manager and also one of the builders. And he's a wonderful man who's also a lecturer in, I believe it's mechanical engineering at the Fiji National University. So he's got many different hats that he wears. The master builder of Andea Yeta is another lovely man called Setareki Domonisere, and he has been boat building for decades and decades. He builds his own with his sons, and participates in annual canoe races that take place in Suva Harbor in Fiji as well, which Andea Yeta actually took part in one of these races in 2015. So she's fully seaworthy and has been on the water, and it's wonderful to see. And then there are also, hold on, I've written down their names here because I don't want to forget anybody. We've also got a man called Koravo Vakaloloma, another man called Ronovosa Bu, and another man called Misaele Tovolea. And they're all from Ongea, which is one of the islands that are responsible for canoe making within Fiji. So they are the specialists of the craft, really.
Oh, Okay. Talk about the meanings of some of the things as well. And we have a question
Oh,
from
good.
Jenny March. Thank you, Jenny. And she asks, what are the shells for? And I guess I'm wondering, so what meaning do they have, if
The
any?
shells are strictly decoration,
Okay.
but they are incredibly significant because they are cowrie shells, first of all, and white cowrie shells are significant of chiefliness, chiefly nature. So having white cowrie shells on the canoe is a symbol of it being of chiefly value.
Okay. And she also asked, and it's a really good question, how many people would sail on this boat, on a boat of this size, like Andea Yeta?
Andea Yeta, she wouldn't have very many people. You know, I'd say potentially there's often about 2 or 3 people doing the work, and I'm no sailor, so I can't tell you all about how you shift tack and all of that. I just know the words, don't quite know what it means. But I think because what you can't quite see here is the sides of the deck. So you kind of see a little house peeking out from the left side of the sail there. And that's sitting on quite a large deck. Traditionally or historically, people would also be sitting on the deck. So they would sit on the deck and sit on top of the house. So you could probably fit about 10 or 12 people on Andea Yeta. However, the historical, and I think the largest one that was ever recorded was something like 100, I'm going to get this wrong. It was larger than the Endeavour, I can tell, if we know how big the Endeavour is, but it was longer than the Endeavour, and it could hold roughly 100, 150 people.
Wow, so really big. And so it's quite impressive. And also, as you were saying before, there's no metal in this. It's all done by handcraft, and the pieces of wood are like one piece, the hulls. So it's a very sustainable type of art crafts as well, because yeah, you're not using anything that they don't get from the local area, although as we know that's being eroded and less harder to, and at least harder to find. But very beautiful looking boat or canoe. And one of the things with it being in a museum is how we greet a boat like this, because and how we interact with her, because she's simply, to maybe some people they just see a canoe, but it's more than that. So it would be nice to find out how, and I think we've got another pic. Yeah, great, thank you, Shahira. So this is how we would greet her in Fijian. And if you could say it, because you're going to do a much better job than I, Katrina. And why is it important to greet her?
So to greet Andea Yeta in Fijian, you would say Nisambula Vinaka, or you can simply say Mbula. So Mbula in Fijian, which is also called Vosavakaviti or Itauke, depending on who you speak to, but it is one of the vernaculars in Fiji. And Bula itself means life. And so, you know, when you're saying hello to somebody, you're also wishing them good health and wishing them good life, which I think is really lovely in that sense as well. And so to greet Andea Yeta, I think in that way, whenever you see her, whenever you walk into the gallery, is really important, because she and all of the other Yao or taonga, taonga is a Maori, New Zealand Maori word for treasures, and Yao is the Fijian equivalent of that. Literally, it means valuables in Fijian. And I think because they're so far away from home, first of all, you know, not with any of their normal surroundings or people, it is just nice to say hello and acknowledge her presence, because she does have mana, which is power or ritual efficacy, and she has been blessed in that way by the builder. So she isn't just an inanimate things sitting in the museum. You know, she and the other Pacific taonga in the gallery are embodied, you know, with life and with the spirit of the culture and the spirit of the people, and often in some cases are ancestors, and imbued with ancestral beings. So it is just really important to, I think, acknowledge that as well.
Right. I mean, because you sit on several Pacific and Fijian institutional and community-led advisory committees for things like this. So you're very well placed to help us understand that taonga are not viewed as inanimate objects by people from the Pacific Islands. So like, treating them is different. Like you said, it's important to say hello and to recognize that. But and so at the National Maritime Museum, we have now got a Pacific Advisory Board called Tangata Moana. And can you tell me why that's important? Why is it important to have this advisory committee?
I think it's important because, well, for a lot of reasons, but I think maybe mainly because one is that the Maritime Museum is an incredibly special place because it houses the only permanent Pacific gallery in the entire UK. So there are temporary Pacific galleries dotted around, and there are galleries that have Pacific sections in them, but there isn't an entire permanent gallery dedicated to the Pacific in the UK. And so having large communities here in the UK especially, and having this very unique and very special gallery in central London, it's very special, and I think really significant to acknowledge the role that communities and taonga have together. Without, you know, with one, you can't be missing the other, and vice versa. And so, you know, reuniting, I think, the two is very important, but also having the community involved in being able to represent themselves and their agency is also incredibly important. And being able to help educate isn't quite the correct word, but, you know, educate the public and the museum about the incredibly privileged role that they hold in being able to care for and interact with everything in the gallery and everything in the collections is just really needed, I think, and something that isn't done in a lot of museums. And so the Maritime Museum leading the way in being able to do this and be a leading example speaks volumes.
Right. Yeah, it's important. I mean, what touched me when yourself and Tash came along and spoke to us all before about various things in the Pacific Gallery, and was just how much things mean to people. I mean, like, there's tears brought to people's eyes because it touches them so much. And it's like, it seems more than sometimes you see people like, oh, I recognize that, or that's from my, you know, we've got one of those in our place in wherever, Ireland or wherever you are. But this was something that was deeply moving and touching, that each, whether the object was taken or gifted, that it's a special, and that it is very important to know how people from that, who belonging to the people, what it means to them, and to find out that, because otherwise you can just view an object, it can look beautiful, but you don't get the whole picture. Yes.
Absolutely. And I think having such a beautiful collection and being able to access it as well, and maybe that's another thing that I should mention that's very important. You know, most museums worldwide can only show 1% of their collection on display to any given public. And so having this entire gallery of Pacific treasures, really, gives a sense of, I guess, ownership back to the communities as well. As we all know, museums are guardians of what they care for, and so being able to, you know, look after these things and these beautiful treasures is only half the job, and being able to share them with the communities is the other half of the job. So inviting that in, and inviting collaboration and you know, proper partnership in taking on that guardianship as well for the community is something that should be done more, and is done more in other nations, especially other nations with Indigenous communities, at home Indigenous communities, I should say. So I was raised in Canada and was very, very lucky to work at the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia. And that's where I did all of my museum training. And so I was taught Indigenous protocol mixed in with standard museum practice. So that's always been in my head and ingrained within me. So seeing it now be able to take shape here just is thrilling. I think it's such a good thing to do for any museum, not just, you know, for Pacific people, but for anyone.
I mean, it's taken quite a while to come to this, but at least it started to.
Yes.
Which is great. The different perspectives of canoes, so between Fiji, Maori, the Cook Islands, there's difference, obviously, but it tells of your ancestry, and it would be lovely to find out from you, to hear your lineage, I guess, in relation to your place, the canoe, the animal. It all has a meaning. So for the canoes from Fiji, how does that relate to you and your lineage or your ancestry in particular?
Well, I think for me, I'm slightly removed from the canoe, I have to say, in lineage sense. So my father's English, I should mention first, and my mother is Fijian, and so she's from a place in northern Fiji called Nukumbalavu, and her mother, so she vasu, so from your mother you vasu to a place, and so she vasus to Nukuni in Onoilau, which is the southernmost island in Fiji, and it's closer to Tonga than it is to mainland Fiji itself. And so she does have ties to that, the Lao group where the canoes do come from.
Right.
But I think just in that voyaging sense, I should say that, you know, to get from that far south up to other parts of Fiji, you know, you would have to get there somehow, and you would have to use the sea to get there. And so in a way, connecting the water to the land is, for me personally, kind of that connection, in that, you know, the land and the sea and the sky are always intertwined. You can't have one without the other, and you can't, you know, survive without any of them. Sure. So that, to me, that connection is the most important. And I even have, although my mother hates it really, but I've got on my back, tattooed in traditional kind of tapping form, I've got a motif of a canoe,
wow.
as kind of part of my way home, so to speak, my way finding.
Right. Okay. And so what in sort of where you're from then, what would have been the closest thing? Would it have been the place, the mountains, or animals that connect to you rather than canoes?
Well, my mother's totem, for lack of a better word, so to speak, is a shark. So I am connected to the water in that way.
Yeah. Great.
Just underwater, not on top of the water.
Great stuff. I like the idea of that also. And I was going to ask you as well, when looking at culture and traditions in Fiji in particular today, how engaged are young people in the traditions and in keeping or in maintaining that, so that people know their story, I guess?
I think that's a really interesting question, Elma, and I think it could take two different answers in a sense.
Okay.
One thing, I guess, keeping it quite topical, COVID has actually been a really good thing for that because of lockdowns and not being able to go a lot of places. There has been more of an interest in kind of knowing your traditional protocol and traditional practice and cultural practices. And there's been a lot curated by Fijians, let's say, online about, you know, getting back to your roots and knowing your roots. However, within the hierarchical, you know, societal structure, youth really don't have a voice in that sense, much like they do in many places around the world. There, it is very much of a, you know, until you're an adult, until you're grown up in however, you know, initiation rites dictate, which are quite different historically than they are today. But you are not always seen as having a voice, nor you should have a voice. So we have these conversations a lot in the project that I'm working on now in Urban Pathways, like you mentioned. And with our youth in particular, and we've got 18 with us right now, some here in the UK and some in Fiji, there is this real desire and tangible want to be more connected with, you know, cultural practice and cultural traditions and being taught. Because a lot of times, I think even we do here, you watch by learning. And if somebody says to you, you know, why are you doing this? And you're told, well, just watch and you'll find out, but you don't actually get an answer. So, so it's interesting. And, you know, when you get older, you'll ask a question, they'll say, well, why didn't you ask when you were younger? That would have been the right time to do it. But you're not really supposed to do that, are you? So we've got youth working across different cultural institutions to try and improve the situation for youth voices and opinions and decision making to, you know, to take place and really start raising the awareness that youth do have something to say and do want to learn. Because I think that's often a misconception of elders, is that youth don't want to know anything, so, you know, why talk about it? But that really doesn't seem to be the case at all.
True. I mean, when someone's culture is removed from formal education or looked at negatively in the larger context of the country, what effects does it have in the community? Because obviously we know from former times and colonialism, missionaries, they all made a difference in sort of making people feel bad about their cultures, their traditions, or even banning them, making them taboo. Not, yeah. So how does it affect community today, or has I guess, is it still a shadow there of that, of colonialism and missionary still there, or are people changing that? Is it changing?
I think it's slowly changing, certainly. There is definitely still that shadow. The education, the formal education system still runs on a Western constructed kind of notion of what education is. And, you know, for some things that's fantastic, for other things it's not. And so I think there isn't as much knowledge sharing going on in the formal kind of education system, although that is now changing in the higher education level. So universities are really starting to prioritize Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of learning. It just hasn't filtered down to the younger kids, which is, you know, really, you know, the older ones now are saying it really needs to start young, and as we know, it certainly does. And I think when it's not taking place, and in my opinion, I should say, nobody else's, in my opinion, when it's not taking place in that formal kind of education way, it does often make it harder to not talk about it at home, but to engage with it more at home, because there is this very split thing where you do something here and you don't do something there. And so there's not that continuity going on. But I do have to say, in the arts and culture sector, especially in the creative arts, there is a huge resurgence in kind of cultural practice and tradition and skill and artistry, and the arts in general are thriving right now in Fiji, and beautiful, beautiful work is coming out, especially in spoken word, which I should have said previously, but a lot of people know that prior to colonization, a lot of cultures didn't have written word or written language. So the idea of oration and spoken word was, normal practice and commonplace.
Mm-hmm.
And, spoken word, poetry slams, things like that, thriving in Fiji and fantastically brilliant.
That's great. That's great to hear that. I love that. And these are things as well. You don't need anything for that. It's words, and yeah, you don't have to have. It doesn't have to be expensive. You can just, like, from when you think of hip hop and all of that kind of, those in that culture where you don't need anything, it's free to just use words and experiment with words. It's great to hear that. I was also going to just ask you as well, what other initiatives are there for young people? And also, I was going to ask you the sails. Sorry, just let me ask that again. So the sails on the boat that the women make, they have different designs, or are they always the same? So when we look at Adi Yeta, her sail, it's not just a plain sail, there are some designs. Are they meaningful? Do they come from a certain place? And like textile designs that are specifically Fijian?
I think for Andea, I'm not sure, but I don't think there's any particular significance to her design. She is made, the sail I think is made in 6 panels.
Okay.
That are put together, and that's commonplace. It would never be a full sail because it would be quite weak in the middle, and if anything happened, it could blow, and that would not be good when sailing. So it's much harder to destroy if it's in separate panels. Now tarpaulin sails are used instead, and most generally because it's much more weather withstanding. If you got that mat sail wet, that would sink your drua. I mean, it would be so heavy with the weight of the water in the sail. However, other textiles and regular on the ground mats, design motifs are incredibly significant and not as regional as they used to be. 19th century, regionally, especially for masi, which is bark cloth, there were very, very, very distinct motifs per region that produced masi. Mats, on the other hand, are still quite regionally distinct, and you do find the different mat producing areas have their own specific motifs and ways of weaving in the black dyed bits, and also the colored border around the mats as well. And different types of mats have different types of borders and all kinds of things like that. So it's very, very specific.
I actually was looking up the last few days. I was looking up some of the designs, and they're really beautiful, and like simple. You can see what things are, or where they're coming from, or what animal, or what maybe the shape of something sometimes, and you can kind of like work out what it is. But they're really, really beautiful. And how many islands are there in Fiji actually?
There are roughly about 330, I think. Wow. Only 100 and something are inhabited. Many of them are just very small dots and little groups. But as with climate change and sea levels rising, they are slowly going under. Other Pacific nations are far worse affected than Fiji. Fiji's quite lucky in the fact that it's very diverse topographically. So the main island, Viti Levu, for example, is incredibly mountainous in the interior.
Yeah.
And Kiribati and Tuvalu and nations like that are very flat and sometimes under sea level in some places. And so Fiji has taken on a role of offering land to smaller nations if needed. And this is where, you know, the idea of climate refugees is coming in, because people are losing their land and losing their homes because of climate change. So this whole new generation of refugees are coming from the Pacific, unfortunately. And that's a horrendous thing to think about, when the Pacific, you know, is one of the, I always get this wrong, it's one of the most affected regions in the world because of climate change, but they do the least to produce the emissions and produce the negative effects of climate change. So it really is the short end of the stick, for lack of a better way to phrase that.
Okay, I mean, it's quite sad, as you say, these new refugees, because the whole islands are disappearing. For you, I don't know when the last time you visited Fiji, but when you have been there, and I mean, I know you're obviously in constant contact because of your work and your projects, but what for you is, when you go there, is the best thing that makes you the happiest when you go there, and the feelings that you get, and what are your hopes for the future?
Oh, you just made me a bit teary thinking about that. Well, it's been almost 2 years. It's 2 years in December. I haven't been because of COVID. However, I am going in the middle of January, so I'm absolutely thrilled. Honestly, it's, to be very cliche and not really answer your question properly, it's everything. It really just, the airport is still in a way that when you get off the plane, you are outside before you walk into the building. So the smell is the first thing that I'm dying to smell again. It's just a very special, I don't know what it is, but it's Fiji to me.
Right.
People, family, places, the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
It's literally everything. There isn't something that I don't miss, even the bad things, even, you know, the pollution in the city and the smell and the bad smell of the city, not the good smell of the stepping off the plane.
Yeah.
But it's
everything.
It's everything. And having that connection, I think, is really important, because for me, growing up in Canada, having a British father, having a, you know, Fijian mother, my sister and I have always volleyed between these three places.
Sure.
And so when people ask me where home is, I have a really hard time answering that.
Yeah.
And often it's just where, you know, where my feet are planted at the moment. But in the back of my mind, there's always that pull back to the Pacific. So I'm very, very happy to be going back again soon.
Okay, great. I just wonder if we have any more questions. Just let's have a look. Just check down there in the chat box. Yeah, please do, if you have any last questions, any questions at all, or any comments. But before we say goodbye to Katrina, it would be lovely if we could have a little look at the Andea in motion, because I think boats are boats, but once they're on the sea is when we really get to see them in action and see their beauty and power and what they're there for. So if we could have a quick look at the recording, that would be great. Thanks, Shahira. It's coming up there. It's quite short.
Fijians are very proud people, proud of their cultural traditions. This embodies a sort of ongoing vigour of skill, craftsmanship. It was made locally in Fiji, made from local tropical hardwoods, and then it's made basically with coconut husk fibre and hibiscus fibre, very strong. The idea is to show people the sorts of canoes that were used in the past and still are used today in some parts of the Pacific. I think it just shows that it's not all old dead things in this gallery. These are things which actually are living traditions.
Thank you. It's very short, but I just felt like we needed to see her. We've been talking about her, and yeah, until you see a boat on the water, you don't really get that experience. So Jenny March has asked as well, can we see the picture of the boat again? So if we could just show Adi Yeta, would be great. One more time.
And Dura are also, I should mention, are very special in the fact that when they want to change, or when you want to change direction, you don't actually need to turn the entire boat around.
Oh.
You just change the tack of the sail. So you change the masthead from one side to the other, and then she just goes in the opposite direction. So there's none of kind of the maneuvers that you would normally have to do in a normal boat, so to speak.
Wow.
But yeah.
Again, just tells you of the craftsmanship of a boat like this. So beautiful. And please do, if you ever get a chance to come to the National Maritime Museum, do visit the Pacific Gallery and come and greet her. She's very beautiful. And we have from Lisa Fabian, she said a comment here, for bringing to, she said Vinaka, for bringing to life such a beautiful object and its many meanings, inspirational insight into Fijian culture and history. So Vinaka, Katrina, and thank you so much for joining us this evening, and anyone who's been watching as well. I hope you've enjoyed it. And please come back next week. We're continuing the story of boats when we will be talking to one of the lone twin, that is Greg Whelan, and that's Wednesday 17th, and it's about Collective Spirit, which was a boat made of donated objects, and it's incredibly beautiful. It's been sitting outside the National Maritime Museum for the last couple of months. I think it's just going now, or may have gone. But again, Katrina, Vinaka, thank you so much. Oh, there's one from Paul Curtis, my brother in Ireland. Thanks, Paul, for watching. He said, beautiful boat, and thank you for the interesting detail about Pacific life, Katrina.
Thank
really
you.
Interesting. Yeah.
Thank you for having me, Elma. It was such a lovely evening, and
Good.
it's always wonderful to talk to you. And thank you everybody for tuning in. It's been really enjoyable revisiting Andea again.
But and also just so important to know, I mean, when we talk about climate change, how much it's affecting people, we see it on the news. It is affecting everyone, but in particular places like Fiji and all the Pacific Islands there. So it's important to recognize this. And again, Lisa, Fabian, thank you both. And thank you, Shahira and Euphemia, who've been there on the Zoom this evening. We appreciate that. And good luck. Have a brilliant time when you go back to your country.
Thank you.
And enjoy. I'm looking forward to going back to my country soon too. It's been
Good.
2 years, and so
Too long, right?
Too long. Okay, thanks very much. Bye-bye.
You.
Take care.